Most people grow up believing debt is something you pay off, close the chapter on, and move forward. You pay your credit card, your student loan, your mortgage, and one day the balance hits zero. So here's the shocking question that challenges everything we think we know about money. If debt is so bad, why do governments all over the world keep borrowing more and more decade after decade without ever paying it off? What if the system is designed that way? And what if the real cost is hidden in plain sight? Welcome to Meta Finance Lab, where you can get more informative videos related to finance. You can subscribe to the channel for timely updates. To understand why governments never pay off debt, we need to travel back in time to the origins of modern money itself. Long before credit cards, bonds, or national budgets, rulers faced a simple problem. Wars, infrastructure, and administration cost money, and taxes alone were rarely enough, especially during emergencies. Kings and emperors borrowed from wealthy merchants, goldsmiths, and early banks, promising repayment with interest. At first, this borrowing was occasional, meant to solve short-term problems, not to fund entire governments. As trade expanded and economies grew, borrowing became easier and more formal. Governments started issuing bonds, which were essentially IOUs sold to investors. These bonds paid interest, making them attractive to anyone with spare money. The key shift happened quietly but permanently. Debt stopped being an emergency tool and became a normal part of government finance. Few people noticed at the time, but this was the moment the door opened to endless borrowing, because debt could now be rolled over instead of repaid. Here is where things get interesting and slightly unsettling. Governments discovered that they did not actually need to pay off the full debt. When a bond matured, they issued a new bond to pay off the old one. The debt never disappeared, it simply changed shape. Imagine paying one credit card with another, forever. It sounds reckless at a personal level, yet at the national level, it became standard practice. You might be wondering why lenders would accept this arrangement. Why would investors keep lending to governments that never plan to fully repay? The answer lies in trust and power. Governments, especially large ones, control taxation, regulation, and currency. Investors believe governments will always find a way to pay interest, even if that means raising taxes or printing money. This belief created a self-reinforcing cycle where borrowing felt safe, normal, and even necessary. 2 world wars forced governments to borrow on an unprecedented scale. Entire economies were mobilized for survival, and debt exploded. After the wars ended, something surprising happened. Instead of aggressively paying down the debt, governments chose to live with it. Economic growth, inflation, and new borrowing made the old debt seem manageable, at least on paper. This period also gave birth to modern central banking. Central banks gained the power to influence interest rates and control the money supply. This changed everything. When governments needed to borrow, central banks could make it cheaper by lowering interest rates. Debt no longer felt dangerous, it felt manageable, even painless. But here's the cliffhanger. Cheaper debt does not mean free debt, and the bill always arrives later. As welfare states expanded, governments took on more responsibilities. Healthcare, pensions, education, unemployment benefits, and public infrastructure all required massive funding. Politically, raising taxes was unpopular, while cutting services was even worse. Borrowing became the path of least resistance. Debt allowed politicians to promise benefits today while pushing the costs into the future, beyond the next election cycle. At this point, debt stopped being just a financial tool and became a political strategy. Voters enjoyed services without seeing immediate tax hikes, and politicians enjoyed popularity. The downside was invisible, buried in balance sheets and long-term projections that few people read. The system rewarded short-term thinking and punished long-term discipline, creating a perfect environment for debt to grow endlessly. You might think there must be a breaking point, a moment when lenders refuse to lend anymore. Sometimes that does happen, and when it does, the consequences are brutal. Countries like Greece, Argentina, and others have experienced debt crises where borrowing suddenly became impossible. But here is the twist. Large economies with their own currencies, like the United States, Japan, or the United Kingdom, play by different rules. They borrow in money they can create. This does not mean there are no consequences, but it does mean default is less likely. One of those ways is inflation. When governments borrow heavily and central banks support that borrowing, the money supply often expands. More money chasing the same goods leads to higher prices. Groceries cost more, rent goes up, and savings lose purchasing power. The debt is not paid off, but it is quietly reduced in real terms, and ordinary citizens pay through a higher cost of living. Another hidden cost is slower economic growth. High government debt can crowd out private investment. When governments borrow heavily, they absorb capital that could have gone to businesses, innovation, and job creation. Over time, this leads to weaker productivity growth and lower wages. The economy still moves forward, but at a slower pace than it otherwise could have. This money does not build roads or improve schools, it simply services past borrowing. The more debt accumulates, the more future budgets are locked into paying for yesterday's decisions. You might ask why governments do not simply tighten their belts and pay the debt down, just like families are told to do. The uncomfortable answer is that governments are not households. A household that cuts spending can recover, but a government that cuts too aggressively can trigger recessions, unemployment, and social unrest. Paying down debt too fast can do more harm than good, at least in the short term. History offers several examples where debt reduction caused severe pain. After World War I, some countries attempted to return to pre-war debt levels quickly. The result was economic instability and political turmoil. These lessons shaped modern thinking, reinforcing the idea that living with debt is safer than eliminating it aggressively. This brings us to the idea of perpetual debt. In practice, many governments aim to keep debt growing, but at a slower pace than the economy. If the economy grows faster than debt, the debt-to-GDP ratio falls, making debt look more manageable. This is often presented as responsible policy, even though the absolute amount of debt keeps rising. However, this strategy relies on continuous economic growth, which is never guaranteed. When growth slows due to aging populations, productivity declines, or global shocks, the debt burden suddenly looks much heavier. The same system that felt stable in good times becomes fragile during downturns. During financial crises or pandemics, governments borrow enormous sums to stabilize economies. These actions often prevent immediate collapse, which makes them politically popular. But the debt remains long after the crisis fades from memory, adding to an already heavy load. At this stage, you might be wondering who actually owns all this government debt. The answer is complex. Some is owned by domestic investors, pension funds, and banks. Some is held by foreign governments and institutions. Increasingly, a significant portion is held indirectly by central banks themselves. This creates a strange situation where governments owe money to entities closely tied to themselves. This circular relationship blurs accountability. When a government owes money to its own central bank, repayment becomes a technical issue rather than a real one. The debt exists on paper, but the incentives to eliminate it weaken even further. The system sustains itself, not because it is efficient, but because it is convenient. Despite all this, governments regularly promise fiscal responsibility and debt reduction. These promises sound reassuring, but they rarely result in meaningful debt paydown. Instead, they lead to slower borrowing during good times, followed by rapid borrowing during bad times. Over decades, the trend remains the same: higher debt, not lower. So where does this leave ordinary citizens? The cost shows up in taxes, inflation, reduced public services, and fewer opportunities. Younger generations inherit obligations they did not vote for, while older debt continues to shape policy choices. Debt becomes a silent force influencing everything from retirement ages to healthcare access. At this point in the story, it is clear that government debt is not just an economic issue. It is a social and political one. It reflects how societies choose to distribute costs across time and generations. Paying off debt would require difficult choices today, while borrowing allows comfort now and consequences later. Here are the 3 key takeaways. First, governments do not pay off debt because the system allows them to roll it over indefinitely. Second, debt is politically easier than taxes or spending cuts, making it the preferred option. Third, the real cost of debt is often hidden, showing up gradually through inflation, slower growth, and reduced purchasing power. The warning is simple but powerful. Debt can feel painless for years, even decades, but it always shapes the future. The choices made today determine the opportunities available tomorrow. The open-ended question is whether societies will continue to accept rising debt as normal, or whether a new approach will eventually emerge. Meta Finance Lab brings you useful knowledge and insights to help you understand the world of finance. Subscribe to stay informed and share with others who need this information.